Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, October 26, 2018. How you doing? Is there a bomb in your mail? It turns out that there are 11th and 12th suspicious packages now identified. One allegedly also out of Florida and on its way, well, I think it got no further than Florida. Addressed to Cory Booker. And let's see, the 12th, as I see reported here, addressed to former Director of National Intelligence Clapper. Intercepted in Manhattan, according to NBC News. So we're up to 12, and that's interesting, to say the very least. We're off on another show for today. Daily Co's Radio is live, as noted by Bill in Portland, who tells us, this is so cute. He says, he thinks, well, I said that I did have the whole show planned out in the age of Trump at that. Good luck with that, buddy. He warns me, I guess, wishes me good luck. Yeah. My plan is to take a nap and sleep through the show. That's my new plan. I had a different one in mind, but I've changed direction, and now I'll do none of what I planned. Breaking news, nothing outrageous just yet that will absolutely derail us, but some of the morning's Twitter chatter, including the 11th and 12th bombs being reported. News today that we didn't cover yesterday, though I saw it and I was tweeting about it, just retweeting other people's good eye for the news yesterday morning. We didn't get to the story, but in case you have missed it, and it's entirely possible that you have, because there's just not that much in the way of national attention on it yet, although it's heating up. A man who entered a Kroger supermarket the other day, I think, was it on Wednesday? Yes, in Kentucky. And a white guy with, you'll be shocked to learn that he had a history of domestic violence and mental problems, but who nonetheless was I'm sure, responsible gun owner until he decided not to be, and entered into a Kroger supermarket in Kentucky and shot two people down and then took off. And of course, it is well worth noting, and you could hardly miss it given the interview that immediately aired afterwards, that there was a racial component to the shooting. A white man armed with his own mental problems, a handheld instant death machine, and a healthy dose of racism. I guess you can't really call that a healthy dose. There's no dosage at which racism is healthy, obviously. And he shot, of course, two black people who happened to be at the store. And how do we know that this was racially motivated? He was confronted shortly thereafter by one of these mythological beasts known as the good guy with a gun. There's subtext to this story, of course, but good guy with a gun confronted him in the parking lot on his way out where he had shot the second victim. And apparently there was a moment of tense face-off there. And I guess we still have to say technically suspect in this case, announced very clearly to this good guy with a gun, who was himself white, that everything was going to be okay. We were going to just go our separate ways because whites don't shoot whites. Now, that's pretty inflammatory and pretty clear about what he was saying. Now, shots were exchanged, and I don't know for sure whether they were exchanged before the comment or after. It would be somewhat telling if we knew that. And that may already have been reported. It's just that I don't know it. And the new twist on the story this morning is that though the suspect was apprehended on Wednesday and had been identified for us by Thursday, no real need to publicize the guy's name. I don't know whether he's somebody who's out for publicity on this stuff or not. But the name's out there. It won't be hard to find if you want to do some sleuthing work and find out something about his background, if you're into that sort of thing. And if you're one of the people who says don't publicize the names, then we can make you happy too. Anyway, he was apprehended, yes, but this morning's news is that he was apprehended after attempting to enter a nearby predominantly black church after having, of course, expressed his racist intent in the shooting at Kroger. And so I guess we were that close to another black church shooting by a crazed racist white guy. But luckily slash expectedly, I guess now in this day and age, the folks at the church had the doors locked. And I guess that was enough to foil this very clever plot. A church member, I am reading from CNN's reporting here, a church member sitting in the parking lot saw the suspect banging on and pulling the door trying to get inside. And, well, it didn't work. Now, of course, there were, according to church administrator Billy Williams, that an hour and a half earlier, they had something going on at the church, 70 people at the church. But at the time he came through, the doors were all locked and there were probably 8 or 10 still in the building. Unable to enter the church. Okay, it's beforehand. Unable to enter the church, he went to the Kroger. Oh, that's even worse, I guess. I don't know. I thought I saw... Okay, well, the headline is pretty clear on this one. I thought I saw earlier that it was that he fled to this church, but in fact, he went to the church and then couldn't get in and then said, I don't know, I guess I'll just find some... I guess he just said, I'll just find some black people nearby, if that was what he was up to. I have no real idea, and I guess when they describe it as a predominantly black church, I assume that's correct, and I don't know how predominant it really was. I don't know what to tell you about that, but it's becoming a bigger story, and rightfully so, and also becoming clear his proclivity for violence. So, that story will develop even further, I'm sure, over the coming days. So, yeah, kind of a scary time. Remember when, I'm so old, I remember when it was a scary time for young men in this country. But that was short-lived. Usually young white men who were afraid of being wrongly accused, yada, yada. But we're right back to it being a scary time for black people in this country because that's the default setting in this country. So things are coming back to normal. I guess that's I don't know what to tell you about that. That's just the sad reality of things. Kate Sherrill says there's more breaking news on suspicious packages. I guess we've got the Cory Booker one noted here. NYPD investigating a suspicious package in Manhattan. That was probably the one supposedly addressed to the former DNI Clapper. We got street closures as a result, and also a confirmation from the FBI on a suspicious package recovered in Florida addressed to Senator Cory Booker. So leave it to Florida man to be the one behind the MAGA bombings. And Kate also has supplied us with a brief roundup of the Kentucky suspects' history of violence. Let's see, is there an article that it links to, or just, yeah, there is. WKYT reporting his what shall we say, background of violence, summed up by our tweeter here. He beat his 2 elderly parents, punched a deputy sheriff, that's usually against the rules, threatened his ex-wife, followed a 15-year-old child into a bathroom, put his hands on her waist and said, "I thought we were family." I'm not sure what that was all about, but I think we're supposed to infer from that he might be unbalanced in a number of ways. But he still had a gun, and hooray for our well-regulated militia. Let's take a look at the details of what WKYT had to say. Anything else that, well, I mean, I think that kind of sums it up in terms of his history of violence. I'm a little, this history goes back to 2003 when he was charged with menacing for following a 15-year-old girl into a movie theater bathroom and putting his hands around her waist. Luckily, it didn't go any further than that. The girl was wise and pushed him away, and good. I think that's hopefully the last we hear of any such incidents from that. And this guy spends a little time inside and off the streets, but, just another great gold star for our gun programs in this country. That reminds me, actually, that there were a couple of other gun-related stories I didn't plan to spend any time on, but we might as well just sort of note them for the record. I believe we are up to 2 incidents this week of armed teachers losing control of their weapons in school. So, good job on that one, everybody. Let's see. I think the first one was actually the second one to come to my attention. If I can scroll through and pick it up here. The Twitter account of the well-regulated militia, who's doing a fantastic job filling in where I have slowed down on gun fail with a tried-and-true formulation. A member of our well-regulated militia, he reports as each time, perhaps she, and a substitute teacher, brings a loaded handgun to an elementary school tucked into his waistband, which is exactly where it belongs, and drops the gun on the school playground. Now, no word here that this gun discharged, but of course, it doesn't really matter that much. It's not a good place to drop your gun. And of course, if you don't want to drop your gun, then tucking it into the front of your waistband is a bad place to put your gun, because that happens quite a lot. The gun a substitute teacher, I didn't even know we were arming the substitute teachers, brought to Anona Elementary School on Tuesday was loaded with 19 rounds of ammunition. According to new information released by the Pinellas County School District on Wednesday. Pinellas County, I believe we're talking about Florida. And I guess it's unless we find out differently in the body of the article, it's still okay to carry a gun that holds a 19-round clip. I guess I assume 20-round clip, but he was short one. But who knows? There are all sorts of weird bullet counts, round counts, I guess. So don't say bullet, don't say clip. That's out there. Let's see. Jones of, I'm sorry, I forgot to say what his name is. Are we not supposed to publicize? He didn't shoot anybody, so it's okay, right? Jesse Nicholas Jones, 31, was standing on the Largo School's playground. Remember, we're talking about Anona Elementary School, when the 9mm handgun fell from his front waistband. An arrest affidavit said he was immediately removed from the school and booked into Pinellas County Jail at about 3 p.m. Tuesday, charged with carrying a concealed firearm. The school was placed on a brief lockdown. But remember, he's one of those armed teachers that's going to bring safety to our classrooms, except if he doesn't. Jones of Oldsmar was released after posting $5,000 bail about 6 hours later. He began work in the district in August and is no longer eligible for employment in Pinellas schools. District spokeswoman Lisa Wolf said, "Why? They're discriminating against him just because he was exercising his Second Amendment rights? How dare you?" Of course the NRA will go to bat for him. You bet. Jones appears to be black, by the way, so that's not going to happen anytime soon. According to school district rules for students and staff, Jones violated a policy which says, quote, "A person shall not possess any firearm or weapon at a school-sponsored event or on school board property," unquote. Can you believe that that's the case in Florida? He could not be immediately reached for comment. I can't blame him there. No other details have been made available. The school district's police department continues to investigate the incident. And that's not all for the week. As I mentioned, the first one that came to my notice was actually the second one to happen. And I got to scroll a little bit further down for that one. But this one also reported by well-regulated militia, which, by the way, if you aren't following and want to find on Twitter, is well_regulated_. There's 2 underscores in there. Does that mean that there was a well_regulated no second underscore already out there? Anyway, this one summarized thus: a member of our well-regulated militia and teacher brings a gun to school. Students have access to it, and 2 boys, 13 and 14, take it. This time reported by KMOV in, where are we looking at here? St. Louis County, Missouri. They're a bit crazy for their guns there, too. St. Louis County, Missouri, by the way, also one of the all-time favorites in gun fail reporting, was also the locale of the big story a few years ago about an NRA certified gun safety instructor who was found to be guilty of forging up people's training documents so that they could, let's say, expedite the process of getting their concealed carry permits. Missouri apparently requires a day-long gun safety training seminar with an NRA certified instructor who could tell you how to be responsible, really also be so super tough and all that, all at the same time, and to do it safely and properly. And anyway, this guy was, in exchange for cash, just signing the paperwork that says you had taken the class. Sometimes he actually made people sit around for a while and listen to his war stories, his literal war stories, and about how awesome a marksman he is. And then he would let them go. And of course, they ended up catching people because they were stupid, and so was he. And he would show up to get their permit, and they figured, well, I'm out of class early. I might as well stop by the whatever the hell office is involved in this thing and file my paperwork so I can get my concealed carry permit as soon as possible, because after all, in 6 or 7 years, there could be a caravan of ISIS people walking from Guatemala to Texas, and I have to be prepared for this here in St. Louis County, Missouri. I got to get my permit paperwork underway immediately, and they would show up with paperwork that had been signed hours earlier, alleging that they had sat through an 8-hour-long class, which, of course, could not yet have happened, and that's actually how they noticed this thing originally. Anyway, that's not what happened in St. Louis County, Missouri this week, unless somebody else is doing it there, which is a distinct possibility. This week, we're worried about this. 2 teenage boys are in custody Thursday in connection with a missing gun originally brought to a North St. Louis school by a teacher. This, of course, like the incident in Florida, will never happen. It is not possible. No one who objected, first of all, no one who ever objected to arming teachers ever thought to bring up the possibility. And I'm really angry with those of you who ignored your responsibility to do this. This is on you, really. Why didn't someone tell us that teachers bringing guns to school would, well before there was ever an incident of an armed teacher stopping a mass shooting at the school with that weapon, that they would, before that ever happens, forget their gun somewhere, leave it in the bathroom, drop it, leave it unattended, kids would get a hold of it, shoot themselves accidentally on school property, what have you. And of course, that prediction, had you people cared to make it, would have paid off in spades by now, because it's dozens of times that teachers and other armed personnel have had gun fail incidents in school in the time that we're all waiting for the big hero to step forward and stop a mass shooting with those weapons. So anyway, like I said, end of this week, Thursday, St. Louis County, a teacher brought a gun to school and decided that they didn't have to follow all the safety rules. Remember, that's the other promise. A lot of these states that now allow armed teachers, and I don't know what Missouri's situation is, but a lot of the states that now allow armed teachers assure those of you who didn't object at the time that you thought something might go wrong. They were faster on the draw, believe it or not, so to speak, than you were. They promised us this would never happen because, come on, the rules are the rules. Obviously, everybody's going to follow the rules because only a responsible gun owner would bring a gun to school, knowing the awesome responsibility that goes along with this. And the gun will never leave their person. It will be on them at all times, so they'll be in control of it all times, and they'll never be revealed, etc., etc. And as we know from the story of the Utah teacher that accidentally shot herself in the faculty bathroom about going on about 4 years ago. I guess maybe it's even a little more than 4 years ago now. Was also habitually in violation of the rules, but nobody ever did anything about it because guns are awesome in this country, and we don't make trouble for people like that, and until they accidentally shoot themselves. We'll see what the rules are here. Police, so far we have this much. Police took a 13 and 14-year-old boy into custody in connection with the gun's disappearance. I didn't read you the little bit about where this happened. The teacher brought the gun to Central Middle School in the Riverview Gardens School District on Wednesday. After school hours, the gun was reported missing, which we really should have known about immediately because the gun should be with you at all times. Police say the gun has been recovered, and that's nice. I guess it was in the possession of this 13 and 14-year-old boy. Moline Acres Police took the report before calling the St. Louis County Police Department, since the county handles the SROs at the school, which this person wasn't, I guess. The story will be updated when more details are available. What? This was already 2 days. Oh, look, and it even says it was updated an hour ago. that was actually updated with more detail. Very typical, I think, of how gun fails are often reported when they are embarrassing to the predominant narrative on gun supremacy in this country. So there you have it. 2 teachers losing control of their weapons in school in the same week. Golly gee, what an amazing thing that is. And what a coincidence. Who would have guessed that people foolish enough to bring their guns to school would eventually, again, be foolish enough to let their guard down and lose 2 of them in the same week. All right, time to catch up on things. And here's the plan. The actual plan heading into the day for how we were going to handle the show, what it was that we wanted to accomplish, that is, with the show, was to focus on the judiciary or nearly adjacent subjects. This was thought perhaps to be an attractive subject for Armando, though I am not certain what his availability is. Either way, there's a couple of interesting stories that can be tied together along those lines. And, well, let's see. Where should we start with these? I should have probably lined these up in an order to take these on, but I didn't go that far in putting these together. And of course, I tried to put them in pocket together, but in the meantime, lots of other stories have jumped in line and butted their way in. Let's see. We already did do that one. That was, I wonder why this is still in here. This was the New York Times coverage of the Heritage Foundation's closed-door training for judicial clerks, but that wasn't what I meant to bring up. Oh, now here's another one. Let's see. I think I wanted to follow that story up when we first did it with this piece here, and of course the break coming up here, but I thought I would open it up and take a look at it because the headline caught my eye, because I've spoken to you in the past about the Law and Economics School of Legal Education, and that's the kind I went through over at George Mason University, and in fact the subject of this piece here from Crooked Timber blog, been around quite a while, many of you probably recognize the name, and a post not that long ago, October 18th, 2018, I think, following the stories about this Heritage Foundation training, entitled Law and Economics, and it starts right out by saying, I've been waiting for this paper to drop, and it's linked herein with a PDF, ever since Suresh told me about it last year. And of course, I don't necessarily know all of the players involved here, but let's see, is there a listing for, it's probably the author of the paper. The author of the piece, though, Henry Farrell, although he just signs his posts Henry here. Well, he's been waiting for this paper to drop ever since Suresh told him about it last year. It's groundbreaking. What it does is to take Steve Telles's qualitative work on the conservative legal movement and then ask a simple question. If we start with the qualitative evidence about the program's intention, then FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act, FOIA the hell out of George Mason University, ta-da, to find out which judges attended the Manny seminars. That's Henry Mann's, he was the original dean, I think, of the George Mason University Law School, and I never did get, he wasn't dean, I don't think, when I was there, but I never did get the pronunciation of his last name, whether it's Henry Mann or Manny, M-A-N-N-E, but to find out which judges attended the Manny, maybe, seminars, and then apply cutting-edge econometrics and natural language processing to their decisions. What are we going to find out? Of course, I told you when the Judicial Clerks program story broke that this was not out of keeping with what conservative activists had been doing for a long time with judges themselves. Now the judges being fully trained, we need to train up their clerks who they replace every year. This big churn on that. Each year you hire new clerks, and if the law and economics trained judges could be assured of a constant supply of law and economics trained clerks, the program would be that much more effective. This question asks, what are the results? Are there common threads and common language used across multiple judicial opinions from multiple judges, multiple federal judges, that seems common and can be perhaps rooted in these particular training seminars? Wrong music, of course. I was wondering about the delay in getting that music started. Anyway, our first break is coming, and I guess on the other side we'll get to the news in this piece about exactly what they did find out. And I'm betting that they're going to find out that basically judges, federal judges who are supposed to do their own thinking, were handed talking points that they applied across multiple cases. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Before I continue with the story we were reading earlier, a note from Miles Grant, who tweets us one of the points I actually forgot to make about the Kroger shooting story was that yes, confronted in the parking lot by a good guy with a gun, nothing happened. No stoppage of any further activity. I mean, there was no further activity, thankfully. But interesting that they sort of confronted one another. And, at some point, I don't know what order it happened in. At some point, though, the suspect says, whites don't shoot whites. And then, sure enough, the white didn't shoot the white. And there you go. I'm not certain whether that was convincing to the good guy with a gun, but more to the point, really, was the fact that the good guy with the gun did, in fact, fire on the suspect in this parking lot in the middle of the day at a Kroger supermarket in the suburbs of Louisville, Kentucky. Luckily, no one else was hit, but he missed with all of his shots. And I think the initial reporting, anyway, was that the suspect exchanged fire with him as well, either before or after deciding that white people don't kill white people, which is also not true, by the way. But so basically the parking lot was sprayed with stray bullets. Thankfully, no one else was shot. But yeah, good point. He grabs a piece of the TPM coverage of it, although it's not clear whether, the TPM's borrowing of AP's coverage of it to make the point that, let me see. Now I might be able to get the chronology of this story if we follow along here. Just skip down. Let's see. Arrest report says the shooter walked into Kroger, pulled a gun. Remember, of course, he's coming from the church, which he couldn't get into. Pulled a gun from his waist. Now, I imagine it came from his waistband or a holster on his waist, but not from his waist in particular. And shot a man in the back of the head, then kept shooting him multiple times as he was down on the floor. So, I mean, as deliberate a killing as you can get. He reholsters his gun, walks outside, kills a woman in the parking lot, and a man carrying a concealed weapon who happened to be in the parking lot challenges the shooter. To what? I'm not sure, but the police say the suspect began firing wildly at him, putting other shoppers in the parking lot in danger. Neither man was hurt in that confrontation, but the initial reporting was that the man returned fire. But there you have it. Bullets exchanged in the parking lot because good guy with gun confronts and challenges shooter. And I don't know what happens, but it didn't stop the shooting activity anyway. Let's see. Here's some further reporting on the timeline here. Ed Harrell, I guess it was a bystander, quoted by the Courier-Journal of Louisville as saying he was waiting on his wife in the parking lot when he heard gunshots. Oh, this is the good guy with the gun. Grabbed his revolver. As he crouched down, he saw the gunman walk nonchalantly by with a gun by his side. Harrell said he called out to ask what was going on. That's the challenge. What's up? And the gunman replied, "Don't shoot me. I won't shoot you. Whites don't shoot whites." That's interesting. And then, of course, there was shooting, wasn't there? Rogers, who is Rogers? One of the police there said police are aware of that statement, evaluating any factors that may come into play with it, thinking hate crimes, I'm sure. Let's see. So that's interesting that he says whites. At what point does he begin firing wildly at him? That doesn't really put a good timeline together for me either. So lots more information to be developed there. Just want to put that out there on the record. Good point. Wanted to bring it up earlier. Armed citizen, good guy with a gun. Not much difference in the outcome of things. Only more bullets being fired loosely around the parking lot. So another data point on all of this stuff. Now, back to the law and economics examination. This sounds like an interesting setup for a paper. I don't think we're going to be able to read through the paper itself on the air. That'd probably a waste of time. Let's see what Henry has to say about this stuff. Remember, the setup here is take Steve Tellis's qualitative work. We'll assume that that's good stuff for now. On the conservative legal movement, then ask a simple question. If we start with the qualitative evidence about the program's intentions, that is to train the federal judiciary in the concepts of law and economics in the hopes that they will apply it in ways that further the conservative agenda in the cases before them, and then make Freedom of Information Act requests of George Mason University to find out which federal judges attended these seminars, and then apply cutting-edge, or any kind of even crappy, probably, econometrics and natural language processing to their decisions. What are we going to find out? Some selected quotes, as well as one quote that isn't in the current version but will likely be in the next. Under the fold, you know how they handle things at their blog, just like at Daily Kos, under the fold, for those who are interested in the headline findings. And here are the headline findings. A pull quote from the paper, presumably. We find that post-Manny attendance, judges render conservative verdicts in economics-relevant cases. Further, using the 100% sample of machine-coded circuit cases, we find that Manny attendees subsequently are more likely to rule against regulatory agencies, for example, the EPA and NLRB. Next, we look at criminal sentencing in the district courts. We find that Manny attendance is associated with harsher prison sentences imposed, Of course, that could be sort of self-selecting. Judges that would agree to attend such a seminar may already be hanging judges as it is, but okay. And I should also note for the record, part of the, I would say even insidious nature of the Law and Economics program is to convince adherents that all cases are economics relevant in whatever way it takes to get you to rule more conservatively. But sometimes the connection is difficult to see. But that's part of the charm of the Law and Economics curriculum, is it teaches you to think of almost everything, if not everything, as economics relevant. Anyway, they also find, in addition to an association with harsher prison sentences being imposed, we show that the difference in sentencing harshness between Manny and non-Manny judges, and again, I'm not sure whether it's Mann or Manny, but we're talking about Henry Mann/Manny, the original dean of the George Mason University School of Law, now the Antonin Scalia School of Law at George Mason University, and the person for whom these continuing seminars are named. So, a difference in sentencing harshness between those who attended and those who did not is highest after the 2005 Booker decision gave more discretion to judges in sentencing. We find that Manny attendance is associated with disparate sentencing. The results are consistent with judges learning a theory of simple deterrence and the use of stereotypes as being economically efficient. That's one of the beautiful / disgusting things about it. It's not that you're a racist, it's that you're being efficient in applying stereotypes, really. That discrimination in prices and in punishment can be analyzed in terms of economic efficiency, documented in the Manny Program archives. Exploiting random panel composition, we document extensive spillovers consistent with both peer and learning effects. Having an economics-trained judge on the authoring judge's previous panel impacts the decision. There is no effect in a set of placebo cases. There are spillovers on rulings against regulatory agencies. And now we continue under the fold, as they say in many blogs, in this particular case on Crooked Timber blog, just to let you know where we are. Law and Economics' key criticism of regulatory policies is that they have a perverse, unintended economic consequence, or rather, they have economic consequences. In the domain of labor regulation, law and economics scholars and judges wrote extensively against New Deal labor law and union protections. In EPA regulation, almost all environmental regulations can be construed as a form of government expropriation that limits how property owners can develop their property. That is how we were taught to think of it. Reliance on economic analysis in antitrust has attained nearly complete consensus. That's one that's an area in which it is very typically easy to convince people of an economics connection in antitrust cases. It's just that they've turned economic understanding of antitrust upside down. This continues. More quotes from the paper here. By the 1960s, the Supreme Court had read into previous statutes a variety of anti-competitive social and political goals, such as protecting small traders from their larger and more efficient, rivals, as well as curbing inequality in the distribution of income and undue influence of large businesses. The law and economics movement advanced the initially controversial view that the antitrust laws should promote economic efficiency and consumer welfare rather than shield individuals from competitive market forces or redistribute income across groups of consumers. In the recent time period, judges who attended law and economics training were less likely to have their antitrust decisions appealed. How do you like that? Judges all like that as an outcome. A more controversial branch of law and economics is the use of incentives reasoning in criminal law. In Becker's 1968 analysis of crime and punishment, the notion of rational criminals works against the then prevailing wisdom of crime as a product of mental illness. This change in perspective motivates deterrence, more police, more punishment, rather than rehabilitation, more social services and mental health treatment, as the preferred focus of crime policy. That probably sounds familiar to you, doesn't it? The influence of economics on legal thought is in part due to a controversial economics training program for sitting judges, the paper notes at this point, the Economics Institute for Federal Judges. The course was founded and organized by Henry Manny, an influential conservative in the early law and economics movement. The institute was the flagship program of the Law and Economics Center, the first academic research center devoted to law and economics. It was funded mainly by donations from, you'll never believe it, conservative foundations and business interests. By 1990, 40% of federal judges had attended this program. That was 1990. At least in principle, the program was billed as a nonpartisan tool to help judges understand their decisions. We need to help you understand your own decisions. But you get some fabulous accommodations, a nice steak dinner, opportunity for golf, etc., etc. All you have to do is listen to us lecture you about how to do your job. Another pull quote from the paper here. In terms of the main lessons, the program strove for ideological balance. Do you believe that? Both conservative and liberal economic thinkers were invited. Empirical panels could include both Orley Ashenfelter and John Lott, for example. Now, I don't know who Orley Ashenfelter is, but I feel very good about him or her if they're contrasted to John Lott, who we do know. The instruction may have been more emphatically delivered by the conservative instructors. Manny himself, who taught part of the course, articulated the view that insider trading, this is a great crystalline example to give if you're still a little bit confused about, well, what do they mean? What is law and economics, and how do you use economic analysis to bias legal analysis? And here, it's summed up in one sentence for you. Manny himself, who taught part of the course, articulated the view that insider trading was economically efficient. You see? So, you can't arrest anybody for insider trading. I mean, the biggest white-collar crime of them all, really, that stole and siphoned billions out of the economy and into the pockets of an increasingly small percentage of the elite in the financial industry. Not even a crime. You should not define it as a crime. It's economically efficient. It's moving resources to its highest value. It's increasing shareholder value. Right? Remember how dangerous we've talked on the show a number of times about how dangerous it was that they made that little bit of rhetorical sleight of hand, changing from stakeholder value to shareholder value. And by the way, it shouldn't be illegal for you to steal money from other shareholders because it's just economically efficient. Another instructor, Professor Goetz, G-O-E-T-Z, not Matt Gates, but Professor Goetz, defended, quote, unequal punishment for equal crime, arguing that discrimination in punishment can be economically efficient. I don't know exactly what he was talking about there, but a good example might be to think of, for instance, sentencing white people who happen to be caught in possession of powder cocaine to lighter sentences than those who happen to be of color and were caught with perhaps the same amount of crystallized crack cocaine. You remember that big story from back in the 90s, I think. In more recent years, the annual reports, and by the way, that's just economically efficient. It's not discriminatory. It's just efficient. Somehow. I don't know how. It just is. In more recent years, the annual reports include instructors with known conservative stances on immigration, like, for instance, George Borges. I don't know whether he's Borges or Borjas. I assume Borges because that sounds more like maybe a white racist guy might be, and I'm applying a horrible stereotype right now. So, more conservative stances on immigration, George Borges. Crime, James Q. Wilson. If any of these judges' names ring a bell, good for you. And family law, Jennifer Robach Morse, founder of the anti-LGBT Ruth Institute. with which I am not familiar. In a Fortune magazine article dated May 21st, 1979, instructors, this goes back a way, instructors' quotes indicate how normative the economics instructors intended to be. Alchian, who's I'm not familiar with, said, quote, "I'm trying to change your view of the world to show you that what you thought was bad really may not be." Ta-da! Terrific. On damages and deterrence, Demsets said motivated increase in sanctions as an agent is not likely to be caught. On damages and deterrence, Dem said motivated increase in sanctions as an agent is not likely to be caught, so the threat of simple damages may not be a tough enough deterrent, and the moral hazard associated with damages, the plaintiffs may wait a long time before they complain because they want damages to pile up. Interesting. On environmental law, Alchian, again, stated, "Give me a capsule that will magically clean all the air in Los Angeles. Beg me to crush it. I won't crush the capsule. Because," this is weird already, "because if I do, poor blacks will have to pay $20 a month more for land rental. The black in Watts, already used to living with bad air, loses his discount for doing that." Wow. I don't remember that specific example, but that's the sort of evil genius that underlies law and economics for sure, right? Like if I see what he's saying here without the flowery language, what he's saying is if I were magically able to clean all the air in Los Angeles, I would refuse to do it. Why would I refuse to do it? If you're asking me, why won't you uphold this clean air regulation? Well, clean air isn't a good thing. And here's why. Where there's dirty air, the rents are lower. And the poor black population of Los Angeles, who can only afford these low rents, is agreeing, in principle, to breathe dirty air in exchange for a discount on rent. And if I get rid of that dirt in the air, if I clean that air up, rents will naturally go up because that's the way markets work. And people will have to pay a premium for that clean air, and poor people won't be able to do it, and they're going to have to pick up and bear the expense of moving to another dirty air place in exchange for yet another discount on rent, which of course is non-existent. I mean, only in economic theory is there such a thing. And in no instance has a landlord ever said outright, well, what I'm going to do is I should build apartments where there's dirty air so that I can say to people, well, sure, the air will kill you, but the rent is low because of that. Don't try to stop polluting either, or your own rent is just going to go up. You see what we're talking about here? This is some crazy, crazy stuff. I mean, it's got an interesting basis in theoretical pseudo-reality, I suppose, but it can be awfully dangerous, but I mean, it's an interesting thought, like I say, in the abstract, but in terms of applying it to like the question of, well, should you enforce clean air regulations now, and coming to the conclusion that no, you shouldn't, because you want to save people money on, the phrase now leads me to say car insurance rather than rental costs. But you see how dangerous that is? That's outrageous. So let's see. There's one more here. On equal opportunity and discrimination, Feldstein said, you should be asking questions like, is it more likely to be this than that? But no empirical skepticism towards antitrust theory was articulated. Okay, that's a little out of context, and I fail to see the connection there. But more pull quotes. Let's see if there's anything else equally outrageous. The program has recognized conservative bias, yet the attending judges are effusive in their praise regardless of ideological standpoint. What is the impact on observed judge decisions? We focus on two agencies the law and economics movement specifically criticized, the National Labor Relations Board, surprise, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Many judges exhibit a sharp and sudden increase in propensity to vote against federal labor and environmental regulatory agencies. The differences in differences analysis renders a consistent picture that many judges become more conservative after the training relative to their colleagues. That, of course, is the goal. This indicates that the Manny program accounts for 28 to 42% of the rise in judicial conservatism. How do you like that? Wildly successful. If peers and precedent also impact the non-Manny judges, then the true Manny impact may explain an even larger portion of the historical shift. And it's a historical shift we've all noted, I think, even just in casual passing. Judges increase sentence lengths by 7%, and any sentence by 2 percentage points after Manny attendance. U.S. v. Booker loosened the formerly mandatory U.S. sentencing guidelines and offers a policy experiment to analyze the effects of judicial discretion. Economics-trained judges render more severe sentences in the fiscal years after Booker. The racial disparity in sentencing between black and white defendants is larger for Manny-trained judges than their colleagues. In addition, the gender disparity in sentencing between male and female defendants is larger for Manny-trained judges than their colleagues. Manny attendance increases use of economics language for Manny judges across both economics and non-economics cases. See, I told you. Judges who sit with economics-trained judges start to use more economics language consistent with a learning effect. And Henry adds here, not in the article, but highly relevant, is a quote from a reminiscence of Henry Manny's influence. And it quotes thus, "Finally, Manny paid very careful attention to the content of the conference and to the approaches and positions of the attendees. None of the many Manny conferences that I attended were ideological directly. There was no clear or, to my mind, subterranean agenda. Nevertheless, while Manny, both in terms of content and attendees, provided for balance, he did not provide for too much balance. As befits a clever market maker, Manny's balance was ingenious. Commonly, extremely prominent liberal economists would attend, such as Paul Samuelson or Ken Arrow. Though both are irrepressible, their positions were often cabined by topics far from familiar to them. Similarly, Manny would typically invite liberal economists to teach at his judges' programs. His faculties uniformly showed political and ideological balance, but again, Manny was in charge of the curriculum. A liberal economist teaching supply and demand is hardly dangerous. A liberal economist becomes dangerous when addressing how to improve the world with unlimited spending of other citizens' tax monies. That Henry Manny would never allow." Very interesting, I thought. And that was sort of a difficult point at which to dive into the broader issue of, the broader theme today of judicial topics. But an important continuation, I think, of the story we learned about the training of clerks. If you were unclear on exactly, A, what they were training them with, and B, how dangerous that could be, I suppose that might have helped clean some of it up, and at the very least would have given us a better understanding, those of us who didn't go to law school or ever bone up on exactly what law and economics is and why it would be considered dangerous in certain ways. I think the example of the air pollution in Los Angeles, I think, made it about as clear as could possibly be. All right, let's see. Other bits and pieces on the judicial theme to continue. We'll use the break to organize these things, but since it's coming up, don't want to get too deep into the next article. I'll give you one or two tidbits that are floating out around there that don't actually necessarily connect to the theme, but we've got this one. I note for the record, and I think passed on also by Kate Sherrill, who has a tremendous record in working for us here. The tweet of Melissa McGowan, our Shakes Tweets pal on Twitter, who says, has this news from, the Daily Beast has this piece. The tweet, though, from Melissa reads, the FBI, it's a quote from the article, the FBI arrested a man in the town of Madison, Wisconsin, perhaps you've heard of it, on Wednesday for, quote, trying to buy radioactive material with the intent to kill someone. That man is Jeremy Ryan, losing GOP candidate for Wisconsin's 1st congressional district. How fascinating. These guys go on to such tremendous accomplishments later on in life, and we're just so proud of them. So there you go. I didn't make it to Congress. Well, then, how about becoming a nuclear terrorist? That's a great idea. Fantastic. Okay, let's see. Another minute or two gives us the opportunity to start on this piece. We won't fit the whole thing in before the break, but I'll give you the gist of it. It happens to come from dailycoast.com. I don't know if you've ever heard of that place. Jeff Singer at Daily Coast has this piece under the headline, Congressman who promised to stop lying about assaulting reporter, now caught lying about it again. Of course, that would be Greg Gianforte. Story is this. The attorney representing Ben Jacobs, the Guardian reporter whom Republican Representative Greg Gianforte assaulted on the eve of last year's special election, has warned the Montana congressman, look out, that Jacobs might seek to rescind their settlement agreement if Gianforte continues to lie about the incident. That could, in turn, expose Gianforte to legal liability for the attack. This would have been a good idea in the first place, but Ben Jacobs thought that as a public figure, Greg Gianforte would be kept in line by the massive shaming and pressure that would be brought to bear if he were not to live up to the settlement agreement. And that was foolish because Greg Gianforte is a Republican and they don't care about such things and they have no shame. So big mistake on Ben Jacobs' part, but we'll see whether he can fix it. The move came after Gianforte told the Missoulian that the statement he had given to the police the night of the attack was my recollection of what occurred, and I also am bound by my settlement agreement with Ben Jacobs not to talk about the incident. In that statement, Gianforte told the cops that Jacobs had provoked the attack. An utter lie and a particularly shameful one, since several witnesses were present and the incident was also captured on audio tape. Whoops. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just a 1 minute break there. Shall we continue with the Gianforte story? Might as well. I mean, there's a court involved in that too, right? So that's the story there. The crux of it there was, one, he's not supposed to be talking to the press about this attack, and two, he talked to them anyway and said, by the way, I stand by the statement that I gave to the police, which was that Jacobs provoked the attack, which was outlandish and stupid and would have landed him in an awful lot of trouble, given that there was an audio tape and several witnesses to the event. But he agreed to say, in exchange for not having to go through with a trial and possibly face jail time. I don't know why he would bother with a deal like that, because supposedly he has no shame, of course. But the agreement was, well, you know, I won't be talking about it anymore, and I rescind my comments, and there was no reason for it, and I shouldn't have done it, and I'm terribly sorry, and I'll give him a fantastic special interview later on. I don't think that ever came to fruition either. But in the meantime, I'll stop saying he provoked the attack. Now, of course, he's back saying he provoked the attack. So, where we left off, Gianforte had told the cops that Jacobs provoked the attack. Now he stands by that, even though everybody saw it and it was on tape. However, Jacobs and Gianforte later reached a settlement in which Gianforte accepted responsibility for his actions and agreed to donate $50,000 to the Committee to Protect Journalists, heading off a lawsuit by Jacobs. And despite what Gianforte now says, that settlement didn't have any sort of confidentiality provision requiring the parties not to talk about the lawsuit. So that was wrong, too. In response to Gianforte's new remarks, Jacobs' attorney sent a letter to Gianforte's lawyer on Thursday demanding that he, quote, immediately cease and desist from further false and or defamatory statements about Jacobs and his interactions with him. The letter noted that not only were the congressman and his spokespersons telling lies about the assault and about their own prior lies Gianforte's new claims about a non-existent confidentiality agreement were also false. Democrat Kathleen Williams, who is challenging Gianforte this year, recently began airing ads attacking her opponent over his appalling assault of Jacobs. Gianforte's own self-serving commentary only threatens to give the issue even more traction. P.S., let's eject Gianforte from Congress. Please chip in $3 to Kathleen Williams today, and you are exhorted to do so with the link included at the end of Jeff Singer's piece, which we'll, of course, include in our daily roundup. Okay, now, back in a roundabout way to the larger theme of the U.S. courts. This is an interesting way to present this. Don't know where this one came from exactly, but one of you geniuses, and I mean that sincerely, not in the Donald Trump sense, did forward this on, I am sure. I don't know. I guess if I scroll back far enough, I can find it. I don't know whether it was a direct deposit that is in the KITM hashtag column or just something I saw in passing being retweeted as interesting from one of you. It is the tweet thread of Matt Karp, who, let's see. You will find him as Karp, K-A-R-P, M-J, presumably his initials, identified in his Twitter bio as a person who wrote a book on slaveholders and U.S. foreign policy. Presumably, actually, a well-known academic, and his web page included in his bio here is princeton.academia.edu/Matt Karp. Are we to take from that he is affiliated with Princeton University or not? I am not certain how I'm supposed to take that. Princeton.academia.edu. Why not just .edu? I don't know. Ask the good folks at Princeton. I'm trying to clear that up by opening that URL, and it's not super cooperative. Here we are. Princeton University history faculty member. There you go. A historian of the U.S. Civil War era. My first book, he says, This Vast Southern Empire, Slaveholders at the Helm of American Foreign Policy, was published by Harvard University Press, which is interesting because he's at Princeton University, and I've never understood exactly why that works that way, but I guess you're free to go as a free agent between universities when it comes for publishing, which is weird because your job supposedly depends on publishing, and maybe that's it. Are you supposed to be published by another university because otherwise, if you were being published by your own university, that looks like they're manufacturing your publishing career so that you can keep your job? I don't know. I'm not a professor. Maybe one of you who is could say something about it. And I will fail to look at that comment on Twitter until several hours after I have finished reading this article. That's my usual MO. Let's take a look at the tweet thread here and get down to business. It begins this way. The years from 1857 to 1861, with Dred Scott freshly inscribed as, quote, the law of the land, saw a wave of radical challenges to the power of the Supreme Court. Now, that, of course, becomes relevant in the modern context because we may want to find, or we may find ourselves forced to challenge the power of the Supreme Court in the very near future. So here's a historical model for it. Dred Scott, terrible law, right? But so that's it. No appeal from the Supreme Court. It's now the law of the land. So with that in mind, here's a 30-part thread, LOL, he says, from my research in progress on anti-slavery politics and the early Republican Party. Remember, the Republican Party started as an anti-slavery party. Amazing, now considering the evolution. So part 2. Today's left, and it's capitalized, today's left has begun to embrace FDR's court-packing plan of the 1930s, but in some ways, the anti-slavery struggle of the 1850s represented an even more sweeping assault on the foundations of judicial power. Abolitionists and Republicans condemned the Dred Scott decision, this judicial incarnation of wolfishness, as Frederick Douglass, who's being recognized more and more these days, called it. Yet They knew the problem of pro-slavery jurisprudence could not be solved by anti-slavery jurisprudence alone. And there is a link here to some research that would bolster that point, presumably. But now on to the fourth tweet here. We can appeal from this hell-black judgment of the Supreme Court, said Douglas. Now, normally we keep saying you can't appeal from the judgment of Supreme Courts. Let's see what he means. We can appeal, of course, to the court of common sense and common humanity. The remedy for Dred Scott did not reside in a lawyer's plea or a judge's opinion, but in mass political struggle. For the Republican Party, that struggle meant declaring political war on the idea of an all-powerful judiciary. After 1857, Republicans responded to Dred Scott, as the historian David Potter wrote, not with, quote, an attack on the decision, unquote, but, quote, an attack on the court. The Supreme Court of the United States, announced the New York Tribune, the largest Republican newspaper in the country, has polluted its garments in the filth of pro-slavery politics. From this day forth, it must stand, ellipses, as a self-disgraced tribunal. And there's a screenshot, a picture, a photo, rather, I guess. It's not, we didn't have screenshots in 1857, right, of the fuller reporting here. It's just the first paragraph or two. Just to give you can we take that pause and to give you a flavor of the language that was used at the time. I always find that historically interesting. This is dated March 8th, 1857. The decision of the Supreme Court. Correspondence of the New York Tribune, Washington, March 8th, 1857. The slavery question has at length found its way into the Supreme Court in all its length and breadth, and that body has fully justified all predictions and all anticipations that the system would find therein a home and a bulwark. The members of that body have done it for all, and more than all that it was ever alleged they would do by those who, like Mr. John P. I don't know what this is. H-A apostrophe E is what it looks like. Is that just a bad L? John P. Hale? It can't be apostrophe E. All right. Those who, like Mr. John P. Hale, have always considered and characterized that court as the, quote, citadel of slavery, unquote. Alas, that the character of the Supreme Court of the United States as an impartial judicial body has gone. And I believe that's an exclamation point there. It has abdicated its just functions and descended into the political arena. Horrors. It has sullied its ermine. It has dragged and polluted its garments in the filth of pro-slavery politics. From this day forth, it must stand in the inexorable judgment of impartial history as a self-disgraced tribunal. And from this day forth, it will be one of the great and leading aims, it's difficult type to read, one of the great and leading aims of the people of the free states to obliterate the shameful record and undo what it has done. And that's the end of the clip that is visible here. It's difficult reading, not only because of bad print, but of antiquated syntax. Anyway, continuing on here on tweet number 7. But what could Republicans do about the power of this disgraced court? By 1858, it contained 5 pro-slavery Southerners. See, all you need is 5, right? 3 of their Northern Democratic dough-face allies, and only 1 moderately anti-slavery justice, John McLean of Ohio. And so the members are listed here in this picture from the reporting at the time. Some suggested immediate reforms, including the appointment of up to 5 new justices. Some suggested, this court is the citadel of slavery, reported one Cincinnati newspaper, and Republicans intend to storm it. Probably the most popular idea, maybe even more radical in its way than court packing, was a plan to, quote, reorganize the entire federal judiciary on the basis of circuit court population. In 1858, William Seward introduced a bill of this kind, which would have created an instant and enduring free state majority on the Supreme Court. It went nowhere in the Democratic Senate, but kept national focus on the court as a bulwark of slavery. And here another picture here of, I don't know what text, but it reads, "The Supreme Court attempts to command the people of the United States to accept the principles that one man can own other men, and that they must guarantee the inviolability of that false and pernicious property. The people of the United States never can, and they never will, accept principles so unconstitutional and so abhorrent." They could. They did. "Never, never let the court recede. Whether it recede or not, we shall reorganize the court and thus reform its political sentiments and practices and bring them into harmony with the Constitution and the laws of nature." I guess that's probably a statement by William Seward regarding his bill. On to the next tweet here. "Ultimately, the most important Republican response was not any of the various technical reform proposals, but a concentrated political attack on the court's authority as an elevated and impartial arbiter of law. Famously, both Seward and Abraham Lincoln accused the court of advancing a pro-slavery conspiracy. Chief Justice Taney had plotted with President Buchanan to craft a piece of legal, quote, machinery that would make slavery lawful everywhere." And here a link to an Abraham Lincoln online speech repository, abrahamlincolnonline.org. How do you like that? Lincoln/speeches, I guess. And, well, I don't need to read you the URL. You can find it yourself, of course, once you get a hold of the day's summary. Next tweet. "Republicans also denounced superstitious worship of the Supreme Court." That's in quotes, superstitious worship of the Supreme Court, mocking the fulsome flattery of life-tenured judges who, by virtue of their high position, somehow transcended mortal politics. In fact, they were just political appointees like any other. And yet another photo of contemporaneous writing to support that assertion. The Tribune even published a general roast of the court, noting Taney's sinister expression and describing the dough-faced Justice Greer as a blonde of rotund figure whose soft and rosy nature succumbs under touch and returns into its shape on its removal. Man, they were harsh in those days. Of course, that would be a terrible ad hominem attack today. Above all, minus the goat effing child molester, I suppose, is the outlier of our era. And by the way, yes, somebody with a good eye pointing out, yeah, MSNBC just literally putting the guy who said that a sitting Supreme Court justice was a goat effing child molester on a panel about the civility issue just yesterday. And guess what? Katie Tour, whose program it was, found herself almost immediately overwhelmed and frustrated by his intransigence, and golly, no one could have predicted that. Anyway, on to the next tweet here in Matt Karp's ongoing thread. "Above all, the Republican assault struck at the fundamental power of the judiciary. The Supreme Court, they argued, had the authority to decide particular cases, but not to settle larger political disputes over the meaning of the Constitution." Very interesting approach to things. And by the way, what this is illustrating for you is that Republicans are both historically and currently, the party that sought to undermine the Supreme Court and its small c Constitution from the very beginning. Sometimes for good ends, anti-slavery, I would have to agree with that, yes. Sometimes for improper ends, like undermining the vast improvements, I guess you could say, that we've made over slavery since its height, anyway. It took an awful long time to get there. Not saying it was a great plot, graphing-wise. It took us a little while. But interesting that they will complain, of course, that Democrats, if they seek to rearrange somehow the constitution of the court in the near future or at any time that they control it, Republicans will insist that this is a horrible and un-American departure from long-standing tradition in this country, except it isn't. They were founded, literally, their party literally founded on that precept, except when the court rules their way, then they're really into it. And so this is a great backgrounder, I think. So again, above all, the Republican assault struck at the fundamental power of the judiciary. The Supreme Court, they argued, had the authority to decide particular cases, but not settle larger political disputes over the meaning of the Constitution. Today, we call this power judicial review. But as scholars like Keith Whittington argue, it really amounts to something much more like to judicial supremacy. And its roots are not legal or constitutional, but themselves political. Included here, something that actually comes from Princeton's own press. Here, a link to Political Foundations of Judicial Supremacy, the book Whittington wrote and to which Karp refers. Should the Supreme Court have the last word when it comes to interpreting the Constitution? The justices on the Supreme Court certainly seem to think so. There's more, of course, to that description. You can check into it yourself. After Dred Scott, Republicans mounted a direct challenge to this power, perhaps the most aggressive popular attack on judicial supremacy in U.S. history. A court makes a decision, argued one New York legislator, but it does not make the law. And that's a familiar refrain in recent memory from Republicans in the past. But now, of course, that they have their 5 votes, I think they'll probably change positions, just as they have on fiscal discipline so often. Next tweet from Matt Karp. Nor was this argument confined to the most self-consciously radical Republicans. Maine Senator Hannibal Hamlin, Lincoln's future vice president, offered a blanket rejection of the court's authority to, quote, decide a political question for us. Of course, that's now a term of art that the modern court uses to avoid adjudicating an issue at all, that dismisses it as a political question. Hannibal Hamlin's quote pictured here. We make laws, they interpret them. But it is not for them to tell us what are the limits within which we shall confine ourselves in our action, or, in other words, what is a political constitutional right of this body, any more than it is for us to tell them what is a judicial right that belongs to them. Of all despotisms on earth, the despotism of the judiciary is the worst. It is a life estate. Tweet number 19. In 1858, Lincoln's famous debates with Stephen Douglas turned on the Republican attack on judicial supremacy. Douglas, like other conservatives, remember that was how the parties were oriented at the time, and we don't have to pretend to be idiot babies here and say, well, Democrats did it. They're the party of racism. Things have changed. Douglas, like other conservatives, accused Lincoln's party of seeking, quote, to destroy public confidence in the highest judicial tribunal on earth, unquote. And here also another picture illustrating it from the, I guess, was it the writings of Douglas or Lincoln? Let's see. The Dred Scott decision was pronounced by the highest tribunal on earth. From that decision, there is no appeal this side of heaven. Yet Mr. Lincoln says he is going to reverse that decision. By what tribunal will he reverse it? Will he appeal to a mob? Not a mob. We don't want that, do we? Does he intend to appeal to violence? To lynch law? Will he stir up strife and rebellion in the land and overthrow the court by violence? He does not deign to tell you how he will reverse the Dred Scott decision, but keeps appealing each day from the Supreme Court of the United States to political meetings in the country. Oh no, not that. Yet Lincoln persisted in rejecting judicial supremacy and also the basic idea underlying it, that law somehow exists before or beyond politics, and thus it was illegitimate to resist the pro-slavery court through popular anti-slavery mobilization. And here, now, a Lincoln quote. "We nevertheless do oppose that decision as a political rule which shall be binding on the voter. We do not propose to be bound by it as a political rule in that way because we think it lays the foundation not merely of enlarging and spreading out what we consider an evil, but spreading that evil into the states themselves. We propose so resisting it as to have it reversed if we can, and a new judicial rule established upon this subject." Tweet 21. Across the late 1850s, Lincoln argued that the American people, not the Supreme Court, were the true arbiters of the Constitution, and that the only way to defeat the pro-slavery judiciary was through mass political struggle. The Dred Scott decision says that the right of property in a slave is affirmed in that Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, any state constitution or law notwithstanding. In my judgment, there is no avoiding that result, save that the American people shall see that constitutions are better construed than our Constitution is construed in that decision. They must take care that it is more faithfully and truly carried out than it is there expounded. Next up, after Lincoln and Hamlin were elected in 1860, the new president's inaugural address articulated this view in perhaps the strongest language he ever used. And I guess it's here. "I do not forget the position assumed by some that constitutional questions are to be decided by the Supreme Court, nor do I deny that such decisions must be binding in any case upon the parties to a suit as to the subject of that suit. At the same time, the candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers, having to that extent practically resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal." Once in power, Lincoln and congressional Republicans reorganized the federal judiciary and packed the court, adding an additional justice in 1863. More fundamentally, though, they simply ignored the pro-slavery precedents established in the 1850s. Does sound dangerous and worrying, doesn't it? But I guess now it's got great historical precedent, and if we were to do the same, Republicans could hardly object if their founding president did the same himself, except that they will because they're Gimitarians. In June of 1862, for instance, Congress passed and Lincoln signed a bill banning slavery from the federal territories, a direct violation of the ruling in Dred Scott. The court meekly acquiesced, recognizing that its political power was long since broken. As the legal historian Charles Warren later lamented, Republicans' popular assault on the court crippled the institution for more than a decade. For me, this was good. It helped make emancipation and reconstruction possible. And here a quote, I guess, from Charles Warren's writing, the bolded part of which we'll read. "The loss of confidence in the court was not due merely to its decision, but to the false and malignant criticisms and portrayals of the court which were spread widely through the North by influential newspapers." False, my goodness. Drawing direct lessons from history is a fool's errand, but at least this should remind us that judicial power, Matt Karp continues, however grandly it may be imagined by friends and foes alike, is critically dependent on political currents. Very true. And I think a point that Armando has made very clearly on numerous occasions. In some way, Karp continues, the left today shares the position of anti-slavery forces in the 1850s, that is to say, Republicans. A rich, well-organized sect whose commitment to property far exceeds its belief in democracy has made the Supreme Court a citadel of reaction. And here, pointing to a piece in The Nation, how and why the First Amendment became a weapon for the right. Perhaps that's something we ought to take a look at after the break as well. Yet, as Keith Whittington argues, the resort to judicial supremacy is not a sign of strength, but an admission of weakness. A beleaguered regime calls upon the authority of the court only to achieve what it cannot accomplish through electoral politics. The boss's constitution has no more chance of winning public support today than the slaveholders' agenda in the 1850s. Of the 1850s, rather, today, as that would be. It is probably the least popular wing of a larger conservative politics that has come to depend on minority rule. That also referencing a piece from Slate that perhaps we can share after this next break. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching Kagro X or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Shall we conclude? Shall we continue? This is the end of Matt Karp's tweet thread, but that gives us some interesting reading material to consider at the end here. Let's have they all loaded properly? No, not the Slate one. Take a look at that. If we can get that thing to load. What's the problem here? Oh, maybe we can rig that up here. Why is that? I'm curious about why that didn't come in here. Well, we'll see if we can't search that up. Anyway, Matt Karp concluding here, we read the boss's constitution in a reference to a Jedediah Purdy article from September of this year in The Nation. How and why the First Amendment became a weapon for the right. The boss's constitution has no more chance of winning public support today than the slaveholders' agenda of the 1850s. It is probably the least popular wing of a larger conservative politics that has come to depend on minority rule. To make this undemocratic project vulnerable, it must be made visible. It may not be enough to question the decisions, the justices, or even the structure of the current court. We may need to challenge, as Lincoln did, the foundation of its power to determine the law. And then one more tweet that he added onto his 30-part thing for a 31st tweet, but unnumbered here. TFW, that field when your epic Twitter thread is scooped by the appeal to reason in 1909. Interesting. And a picture of a newspaper article of the Times, 1909, Despotic Power of Supreme Court. Historic sketch of its usurpations to buttress capitalism and make plutocracy triumphant. And I guess one pull quote here that he thought worth including. But I forbear to quote. It would require a volume to make an exhaustive compilation of the literary remains of jurists, statesmen, authors, editors, and other distinguished men who have denied the right of the Supreme Court to exercise the judicial veto. The South stood by the Supreme Court in those days because it was the ally of slavery. The money power stands by it today because it is the ally of capital. And I guess you should probably keep in mind that it is by design that it is the ally of capital, and in case the design itself didn't strongly enough ally it with capital, something, what did they say, 40% of the judiciary, now probably an even greater percentage, has been attending law and economics seminars And I don't think it's a huge stretch for you to imagine and draw the conclusion that a law and economics seminar is all about proactively forcing the courts onto that square to ally them with capital. And some of the things we've discussed in the past on this show would, I think, bear that out. Why is it that we value shareholder value over more broadly stakeholder value? And I think we've posited in the past here that there is a very heavy bias in favor of capital versus any of the other factors that go into production. We're all taught, in basic economics, labor and capital together, the indispensable ingredients of production. Why favor capital over labor? And some of it is just law and economics at work even before the two were paired as a term of art. Capital is just more highly favored in this country for a number of reasons, not the least of which is its portability and adaptability. Not all labor can be adapted to all purposes, but all capital can be adapted to all purposes. Not all labor is easily transported to new locations where production would make sense, but capital is fairly easily transportable. And of course, we've gone to great lengths to make and keep that as the case, even when moving capital meant, shipping chests full of gold on a Wells Fargo wagon from one part of the country to another, gold coinage or maybe even later paper currency. But now, of course, we can do it all electronically, and banks can you can't electronically transfer labor from one place to another. It's an expensive proposition. So perhaps there's some natural law as such, some natural law justification for favoring capital over labor, but not necessarily in every case, and it wouldn't be correct in each case, nor is it necessarily healthy for the economy to do so. But it would be economics that teaches us that, and it would be law and economics that teaches us that, that being the case, the favoring of capital over labor making a certain amount of natural sense, it ought to be applied across the board in law. You ought to favor capital over labor. It's much more versatile. It's much more efficient. It's not that you are discriminating against labor or laborers, though, wink, wink, you really are. It's that you're simply saying it's a lot more efficient to allocate resources given the flexibility of capital, so you ought to favor it even when there's no particular reason to favor one over the other. It just ought to be your default position. And I think that explains an awful lot of how we've ended up where we are in a number of different situations. Now, let's see if we can find a way to get this Slate article. The URL suggests that the title of the piece is Minority Rule Not in the Constitution. I wonder if I can Google search that. If we had production assistance, that would be something that I could simply assign to somebody. But Minority Rule Not in the Constitution. And that was from Slate. And let's see what I get out of that from Google. Minority rule is not what the Constitution intended. Let's see if that URL will open. Yep, Jamel Bowie. Just as I thought. It was hinted by the appending of his Twitter handle to that tweet by Matt Karp. Minority rule does not have to be here forever. Arguing that the framers intended it is specious and ignorant of history. Let's take a look at that, because I think that probably plays into our larger theme. And where else are you going to get a show focused for 2 hours on this? I can think of only 7 or 8 other places. Jamel Bowie's piece here. A central architect of the Constitution, James Madison was deeply sensitive to the threat majorities posed to minorities. On important social questions, no other rule exists but the will of the majority, he wrote in 1785 while a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. But it is also true that the majority may trespass on the rights of the minority. Our governing document shows this sensitivity in its structure, which diffuses power across multiple institutions, creates opportunities for representation at each level of government, and attempts to stymie passionate majorities in favor of deliberative ones. But Madison wasn't a minoritarian. He believed majorities, properly structured around consensus, had the right to govern. That belief should inform our understanding of the present, where the Republican Party holds all three branches in Washington despite less than majority support among the public at large. This is a continuing problem, isn't it? This was dramatized by the recent confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh was nominated by a minority president who lost the national popular vote by 3 million ballots. Unpopular from the start, Kavanaugh's standing collapsed in the wake of Christine Blasey Ford's credible allegation of sexual assault. He was confirmed by a narrow majority of the Senate, representing just 44% of all Americans, and more Americans opposed his confirmation than supported it. Now, aligned with 4 other conservative justices, including one nominated by his patron and 2 others by a president who also entered the White House with minority support, Kavanaugh will likely back jurisprudence that enables voter suppression and extreme partisan gerrymandering, allowing the Republican Party to strengthen its anti-majoritarian hold on power. With Kavanaugh's confirmation, an electoral minority is now essentially dictating the terms of constitutional interpretation, thanks to 2 institutions: the Electoral College, which favors the geographical distribution of supporters, not the total number, and the Senate, which creates huge disparities of representation, based on the same principle, I think. A majority of Americans, he notes parenthetically, are represented by just 18 senators. While there is no clear relationship between partisanship and state size, some small states are heavily Democratic and some large ones are heavily Republican, the present configuration of state partisanship makes the GOP Senate majority a minority of the overall population. Even the House of Representatives no longer conforms fully to principles of majority representation because of gerrymandering. Come November, Democrats will have to win the House by at least 7 points to claim a majority of seats. At least one report says Democrats need to win by double digits to gain a majority. By contrast, Republicans could win just 45 to 46% of the overall House vote and still hold on to the lower chamber. Minority rule on this scale is unprecedented in recent American history, and many liberals are either concerned or angry. I am very far from being a majoritarian or populist Democrat, wrote political theorist Jacob Levy on Twitter, but it's a problem for democratic government if the majority can't gain entry anywhere. The conservative response to this liberal discontent is to scoff, dismissing arguments for a rethinking of the structure of American democracy. National Review provides the traditional explanation for the Senate and Electoral College. The design and the Senate recognizes the status of the states as real governing entities with their own prerogatives under the Constitution. Like the equally hated Electoral College, the Senate ensures that flyover country isn't ignored. It reflects the dizzying geographic diversity of a continental nation and promotes national cohesion by giving every corner of it a voice. Conservative writer Lyman Stone goes even further. The thing you have to remember is that not only did the founders fully understand the issue with lopsided state populations, the foundations of our legislative system were specifically designed to underrepresent populous states. The Senate's malapportionment is intended. Activist and commentator Eric Erickson writes, the Supreme Court is full of goat-effing child molesters. Oh, in this case, he writes, the founders systematically put in place checks on the majority, which they viewed as a mob. Conservatives aren't just channeling a familiar narrative that the system was meant to stymie majority action. They are making a case that minority rule reflects the original intentions of the framers of the Constitution. For them, minority rule is a legitimate outcome produced by a sacred process not subject to dispute. But this rests on a vision of the framing of the Constitution that ignores the fierce arguments that rocked the Constitutional Convention of 1787. To say, for example, that the framers consciously built minority rule into the Senate is to ignore the actual debates around the structure of the chamber, which show fierce disagreement leading to a tepid compromise between two sides, one advocating proportional representation and the other backing equal representation of the states. Madison flatly rejected the latter. Whatever reason might have existed for the equality of suffrage when a union was a federal one among several states, it must cease when a national government should be put into place. On its first vote, the committee responsible for designing the chamber agreed on proportional representation. The Senate's cooling function, its ability to be more deliberative, would rest not on equal representation, but on its smaller size and longer terms of office for members. It's worth mentioning as well in discussions over state sovereignty that Madison wanted to give the Senate a veto over state legislation. When small state representatives pushed for equal representation, which had been a feature of the Articles of Confederation, Madison and other advocates of proportional representation in the Senate responded with sharp arguments against. Madison dismissed the fear that large states would gang up on their smaller counterparts, pointing to cultural and economic differences among large states. In point of situation, they could not have been more effectually separated from each other by the most jealous citizen of the most jealous state. That's quote. Madison even made the pointed and to modern ears familiar argument that the real division between the states was North and South, free and unfree. He summarizes the point in his notes from the convention in which he contended that the states were divided into different interests not by their difference of size but by other circumstances, the most material of which resulted partly from climate but principally from the effects of their having or not having slaves. Benjamin Franklin, another opponent of equal representation of states, pushed back against the idea that small state citizens would be burdened under proportional representation. The interest of a state is made up of the interests of its individual members, he said. If they are not injured, the state is not injured. Pennsylvania's James Wilson was more prophetic. Equality of votes among the states will subject the majority of the people and property to be governed by a minority of each. This, he said, was too palpable an error, too great a defect in the Constitution to permit the expectation of public harmony and happiness. But small state representatives wouldn't budge, using the threat of exit to force compromise, the original Brexit. In Federalist number 62, Madison says it is superfluous to justify the Senate according to Republican principles. Instead, it is the result of a spirit of amity. Rather than lose the small states from the Union, the advice of prudence must be to embrace the lesser evil. Put simply, key voices anticipated the problems the Senate might pose for governance and democratic representation. The future Americans for whom the framers entrusted the republic and its maintenance, to whom, that is, might seek reform to solve those problems, is not an attack on the intent of the Constitution. It is in keeping with the debates around its creation. The same is true for those who seek a stronger majoritarianism in the operation of American governance. Conservative claims that the framers, quote, feared the mob also miss the nuance of their arguments. And, by the way, the number of mobs. In Federalist number 10, the one they actually make you read, Madison acknowledges, as he had in the past, that popular government is vulnerable to an interested and overbearing majority, but he then pivots, to his crucial insight. The problem isn't majorities per se, which are capable of acting in the interests of the whole. It's the facetious spirit in public administration. I'm sorry, facetious is the wrong word, although perhaps it's the right one. Factious. I'm getting tired at the end of the program making these mistakes. The factious spirit in public administration. What are factions? You all know this because they made you read Federalist number 10. He defines them as citizens who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. By Madison's standards, if there is a mob in today's politics, a faction adverse to the rights of other citizens, it's the Republican Party, caught in the grip of demographic panic, ideological extremism, and growing authoritarianism. Madison argues that the nation would be able to deal with minoritarian factions. The majority can just outvote them. Majoritarian factionalism is trickier. There, the solution is a large polity that includes a number of diverse interests that can diffuse the power of faction. Barring that, diversity itself acts as an obstacle to the formation of factional majorities. There are too many interests operating for their own gain for an overbearing majority to coalesce. What's key is that Madison wants majorities to govern. He believes it to be the central principle of Republican government, but his concern was building sustainable majority rule, where the losers of political conflict aren't excluded from governance, full stop. Lurking behind arguments about majority or minority rule is a more fundamental dispute about the structure of American democracy. Was it set in stone with the ratification of the Constitution, or is it subject to reform and revision to meet the changing sensibilities and beliefs of Americans? Understanding the debates around the Constitution, of the degree to which the framers and ratifiers struggled with complex and unanticipated questions whose answers weren't easily forthcoming, helps us to see how the process and theory behind the document suggests Americans ought to question institutional design when it conflicts with the principles of majority rule and representation of the whole. Faced with a government that resolutely represents a minority of Americans, the proper response is the kind of constitutional debate that conservatives have dismissed out of hand. Indeed, looking at the whole of American history so far, we shouldn't think of the framing as a singular event that began in 1787 and ended with ratification. The framing of the Constitution is continuous, an ongoing process by which Americans revise their understanding of the Republic in fits, starts, and occasional moments of revolutionary action. The Reconstruction Amendments that abolished slavery, established equal protection, and gave black men the vote transformed the relationship of individual to state, of state to nation. The 17th Amendment, which established direct election of senators, enshrined much of Madison's vision for the chamber, making it a body for national deliberation, where each member represented individual citizens, not their states per se. The 19th and 26th Amendments expanded the electorate, greatly widening the sphere of democracy. The civil rights laws of the 1960s operated in similar ways, enshrining the principle of racial egalitarianism even as we struggle to make it a reality. If, in the first decades of the 21st century, partisanship, polarization, and demographic change have made our democracy increasingly unrepresentative, if millions of Americans fear the prospect of judicial supremacy in opposition to their lives and freedoms, then they're right to take a page from the framers and work to align our institutions with our democratic beliefs, convictions, and intuitions. Calls to transform the Senate, or create new states, or even pack the court aren't attacks on norms. They are Americans doing the hard work of crafting a democracy that works for them, of taking seriously the idea that the Constitution exists for us and not us for the Constitution. Okay. And that leaves us with just a few minutes here. Not enough time to get to the boss's Constitution, how and why the First Amendment became a weapon of the right, but highly recommended nonetheless, just to fill things out here. Let me then jump over to a piece we can use to wrap things up, so to speak, both on the question of the historical struggle for or over judicial supremacy and current events and things in the news. Many of you will have seen by now and reacted by now to the story as outlined in this tweet from Mary Jordan, Washington Post correspondent, and, as her bio tells us, author of The Prison Angel and Hope, a memoir of survival in Cleveland. Why do I feel like I need to throw that in? Because Mary Jordan's name doesn't ring a bell to me, because I don't pay attention to names and they don't ring bells for me very well the way they do for the rest of you. But Mary Jordan tweets from this Washington Post event, presumably, which Karen Tumulty was having a discussion for some unknown reason. Apparently she thought it would produce news beyond the sensational if she spoke to Newt Gingrich, whose ties are getting to be just about as long as Donald Trump's, as he gets to be just about as round as Donald Trump. But here's the observation that many of you probably caught last night. If Dems take control of the House and subpoena Trump's tax returns, Gingrich told Karen Tumulty, that the legal fight would go to the Supreme Court. And that's not hard to anticipate. But it was the comment that came after, I think, that grabbed the most attention, as it is included in all caps here in Mary Jordan's tweet. So it goes to the Supreme Court, quote, and we will see whether or not the Kavanaugh fight was worth it. Audible gasps in the audience as he spoke. It attaches an article, I guess, summarizing the fuller exchange, but that's the most salient point of the whole thing. In other words, if the Dems actually want to get a hold of Trump's tax returns and subpoena them in the House, then the whole point of the Kavanaugh fight, the whole point of ignoring the allegations of his sexual misconduct and predations and installing him on the court nonetheless, will determine, we'll finally see whether all of that embarrassment and all of that abandonment of principle, though they never had that principle, but all the embarrassment that comes from the fact that we recognize that everybody else has principles, will be worth it if only this sexual predator will agree to protect this president from any valid inquiry that might be undertaken by the House of Representatives should it fall into Democratic hands. Audible gasps, but that's what he loves. Gingrich lives for the audible gasps from the audience. Let's take a look and see if there's anything else that needs to be gleaned from that particular piece. I don't think so. I think you got everything you needed out of that. And in fact, it's just that grab quote and some video accompanying it. So there you have it. In other words, all of what has been described in the previous segment and all of what we read about struggles, about the politicization of the Supreme Court, what to do about it, what people in history have done about it, what Republicans used to do about it, but no longer will unless it becomes time for them to do it again. And remember that they flip-flop back and forth depending on the political realities of this. And I think that's proof of concept, right? When they're in a certain position politically, they feel this way about the court. When they're in the opposite position politically, they feel the opposite way about the court. Just as, I guess a good example of how that would be is how the Judicial Crisis Network. This is a dumb example, but it's pretty on point, really, if you take a look at it. But the Judicial Crisis Network has switched back and forth in name depending on whether Republican presidents were in power trying to appoint Republican judges to the federal bench, or Republican presidents or Republicans in the White House were out of power and Democrats were attempting to put people on the federal courts. When it was Democrats and their presidents, the Judicial Crisis Network, we need conservative justices and we need to stop Obama and or Clinton's liberal activist judges from being put on the court. It's the Judicial Crisis Network. When they were about the business of getting federal judges from Republican presidents placed on the court, they become the Judicial Confirmation Network. They just changed the letter of the C in there. So they're gimme-tarians at heart. Whatever it is we need, we'll go after it, regardless of whether it is a real thing or not, violates norms or not, is unconstitutional on its face or not, is simply petty corruption on behalf of a greedy dictator tyrant or not. That doesn't appear to bother them one way or the other. So, okay, I thought hopefully we put together a coherent narrative for you over the course of the 2 hours today. And if not, and you're craving more coherent narrative, well, you can always stick around for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam. Now we'll attempt to get the slow-ass laptop to cough up the summary of today's show so that you can, be aware of what you're walking into. It's not about deciding whether or not you're going to listen. I know you will. All right, well, here's what we got, starting off in the Bistro Cafe. You can't brutally blame the victim if you don't blatantly blame both sides. Big Tobacco raises a record-breaking $17.5 million to defeat Montana's Medicaid expansion. Haven't heard from them in a while. DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen says no plans right now to shoot refugees in the refugee caravan. That's good. They don't plan to shoot her either. And it's been a strange few weeks in the case of Russian spy Maria Butina. Yes, absolutely. We need to catch up on her. Thankfully, Justice will take care of that work. Coming up next, there's more, of course. We'll try to shout over this announcement to tell you about it after this.
Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
All right, after the break, they move to the chef's table where the U.S. judge in the Trump Foundation case shut down attempts for a political bias defense, and Georgia conveniently lost 4,600 vote-by-mail ballot requests submitted by Democrats and only Democrats. Can you believe it? If you can't, you will after this.